I nearly died during emergency surgery. When I finally opened my eyes in recovery, I expected to see my parents waiting beside my bed. Instead, the chairs were empty. They had left me alone to attend my brother's championship game. What happened next changed my family forever. The first thing I heard was the steady beeping of a monitor. Then came the pain. It hit like a wave the moment I opened my eyes. My body felt heavy, my throat was dry, and every breath reminded me that something had gone terribly wrong. The last thing I remembered was collapsing in my apartment. After that, everything was a blur. A nurse named Marisol noticed I was awake and quickly came to my bedside. She spoke softly, explaining that I had undergone emergency surgery after a ruptured ovarian cyst caused severe internal bleeding. The doctors had managed to stop it in time, but she didn't hide how serious it had been. My eyes drifted toward the empty chairs beside my bed. No parents. No family. No familiar faces at all. Marisol hesitated before telling me the truth. My parents had left hours earlier. Tate had a state championship game 3 hours away, and they decided they couldn't miss it. Before we get into it, tell me where you're watching from and subscribe if you're new. What happened next changed the way I saw my family forever. After Marisol stepped out, I reached for my phone. My hands were shaking. Part of me expected missed calls, worried messages, anything that showed someone had been thinking about me. There was only one notification. A text from my mother. For a second I felt relief. Then I opened it. It was a photo of Tate holding a trophy, smiling from ear to ear. Underneath was a single caption. "He did it." I stared at the screen in silence. I had nearly died. And somehow I still wasn't the one they chose. I kept staring at the message long after the screen dimmed. A photo of Tate holding a trophy. A crowd cheering behind him. My mother's caption was only 2 words, but it said everything I needed to know. He did it. Not, "How are you feeling?" Not, "The doctor said you're okay." Not even, "We're sorry we couldn't stay." Just Tate. Marisol noticed the look on my face almost immediately. She pulled a chair closer and sat beside my bed. "Is there someone you'd like me to call?" she asked gently. I appreciated the question more than she probably realized. I thought about Piper. She was the one person who would have dropped everything for me if she could. Unfortunately, she was out of state for work and wouldn't be back until the next morning. "No," I finally said. "There's nobody." Marisol gave my hand a quick squeeze before leaving me to rest. But rest never came. The pain medication dulled the sharp edges, yet every time I started drifting off I woke again. The room felt too quiet. Too empty. Around midnight I picked up my phone and opened the voice recorder app. Years earlier, during a difficult stretch in college, a therapist had suggested recording my thoughts when they became too heavy to carry alone. I hadn't used the app in months, but that night I pressed record. I started talking about the surgery. About waking up scared. About seeing empty chairs where my family should have been. At first it felt silly. Then the words kept coming. The more I spoke, the more memories surfaced. One in particular refused to leave. I was 11 years old, standing backstage after a piano recital. I had practiced for months. As other children ran into their parents' arms, I waited near the curtain, holding my program and scanning the crowd. Mom and Dad had left before I even performed. Tate had a little league game across town. I remembered sitting alone afterward while a teacher waited with me until someone finally came to pick me up. Lying in the hospital bed, I realized the surgery wasn't the real reason I was hurting. This wasn't one moment. It was a pattern. 2 days later, my parents finally walked into my room. They looked relaxed, sunburned from being outside all weekend. Dad carried a stuffed bear while Mom immediately pulled out photos from the championship game. Both of them were smiling. Neither of them apologized. Not once did they mention leaving me alone after a surgery I had nearly not survived. My parents stayed for less than an hour. Most of that time was spent talking about Tate's championship game. Mom showed me pictures while Dad replayed every important moment as if I had been waiting to hear the details. I listened quietly for a while before finally gathering the courage to say what had been weighing on me since I woke up. "I was scared," I said softly. When I opened my eyes and nobody was there, I didn't know what had happened. For a second I thought maybe they would understand. Instead, Mom shook her head. "Ren, you're exaggerating," she said. "You were never in real danger." The words hit harder than I expected. The surgeon had told them exactly how serious the situation had been. They knew I had nearly bled internally for hours before doctors found the problem. Yet somehow my fear was being treated like an overreaction. Before I could respond, Dad jumped back into another story about Tate's winning play. Just like that, the conversation moved on. A few days later, I was discharged. The nurse handed me paperwork and asked who was picking me up. I checked my phone. Nothing. No message from Mom. No message from Dad. I called Piper hoping maybe she had returned early, but she was still traveling and hundreds of miles away. "I'm so sorry," she said. "If I could get there, I would." "I know," I told her. After hanging up, I ordered a taxi. The ride home felt longer than it should have. Every bump in the road sent pain through my abdomen. I sat quietly in the back seat, staring out the window and trying not to think about the fact that nobody had come. Something changed during that drive. Not dramatically. Not all at once. But a small part of me stopped expecting my parents to show up. The weeks that followed were slow. Recovery took longer than I wanted. Some days simply walking across my apartment felt exhausting. Mom and Dad called often, but I started letting more calls go to voicemail. It wasn't punishment. I just didn't have the energy to pretend everything was normal. When Piper finally came home, she became my lifeline. She brought groceries, checked on me daily, and sat with me when the apartment felt too quiet. One evening after she left, I opened the voice memo I had recorded in the hospital. I listened to my own voice describing the empty room, the fear, and the loneliness. For the first time, I realized why I had recorded it. Not for revenge. Not to prove anything to anyone else. But so nobody could ever convince me that it hadn't happened the way I remembered. As my recovery continued, I found myself thinking less about the surgery and more about everything that had come before it. The hospital had not been an isolated incident. It was simply the moment I could no longer ignore what had always been there. Looking back, the differences between Tate and me were impossible to miss. When Tate started college, my parents paid for everything. His tuition, housing, books, and expenses were covered without hesitation. They even surprised him with a brand new car before his first semester began. I remember standing in the driveway smiling for pictures with him, pretending I wasn't comparing it to my own experience. I had taken out student loans. I worked part-time jobs whenever I could. And the car I drove was a 15-year-old hand-me-down that broke down often enough for me to keep jumper cables in the trunk. At the time, I convinced myself there had to be a reasonable explanation. But the explanations never seemed to apply equally. One memory kept returning more than any other. My college graduation. I had spent 4 years working toward that day. I reserved seats for Mom and Dad weeks in advance and kept checking the crowd before the ceremony started. The seats stayed empty. Later, they explained that Tate had a scrimmage that weekend and they didn't want to miss it. A scrimmage. Not even an official game. I told myself I understood, but the truth was that I cried in my apartment afterward when nobody could see me. The older I got, the clearer the pattern became. Dad had built his entire identity around Tate's athletic future. Every win felt personal to him. Every achievement became proof that the sacrifices were worth it. Mom wasn't much different. She loved telling neighbors and relatives about Tate's accomplishments. His trophies were displayed throughout the house like family heirlooms. When I achieved something, the response was usually polite. A smile. A quick congratulations. Then the conversation moved on. One afternoon I finally called Mom and tried to explain how I felt. I wasn't angry. I wasn't accusing her of anything. I simply wanted her to understand. For a moment she listened. Then she sighed. "Ren, you've always been the sensitive one." The familiar words landed exactly the way they always had. Before I could answer, she ended the call. I stared at my phone for a long time afterward. Then I made a decision. I stopped reaching out. No calls. No texts. For the first time in my adult life, I let the silence stay exactly where it was. Several weeks passed without much contact between me and my parents. The silence that had once felt uncomfortable slowly became normal. I focused on healing, getting back into my routine, and spending time with people who actually showed up when they said they would. Piper remained a constant presence through all of it. She checked on me regularly, dragged me out for coffee when I was spending too much time alone, and never made me feel guilty for keeping my distance from my family. Little by little, life started feeling manageable again. Then late one weeknight my phone rang. I glanced at the screen and froze. Dead. For a second I considered letting it go to voicemail. Instead I answered. The moment he spoke I sat upright. Something was wrong. Dad's voice sounded shaky and uneven. I had never heard him like that before. He wasn't the type to cry or panic. Growing up, he always seemed in control no matter what was happening. "Ren," he said. "It's Tate." My heart immediately dropped. Dad explained that Tate had been in a serious car accident while driving home from practice. He survived the crash, but the situation had become far more complicated than anyone expected. The injuries had triggered a severe medical condition. His blood counts had suddenly collapsed and doctors diagnosed him with aplastic anemia. I listened carefully as Dad repeated what the specialists had told him. Tate's body wasn't producing enough healthy blood cells to recover properly. The doctors were discussing treatment options, but they believed a bone marrow transplant might be necessary. Then Dad broke down. Actually cried. For a moment I couldn't even process it. I had never heard my father cry in my entire life. All the anger I had carried for weeks seemed to disappear. The hospital room. The empty chairs. The missed milestones. None of it mattered in that moment. Because this wasn't about my parents. This was about Tate. Whatever problems existed between me and Mom and Dad, my brother had never been the source of them. "How bad is it?" I asked quietly. There was a long pause. "Bad enough that we're scared," Dad admitted. I closed my eyes and took a slow breath. "I'll be there tomorrow morning." After the call ended, I sat alone in the dark living room. Part of me was terrified for my brother. Another part couldn't ignore the irony that the same parents who had spent years overlooking me were now calling because they needed me. And I wasn't sure what to do with either feeling. The next morning I woke up earlier than usual. I barely slept after Dad's phone call. My mind kept replaying everything he had said about Tate, the accident, and the transplant doctors discussing possible donor matches. I was getting ready to leave for the hospital when a sudden knock echoed through my apartment. I frowned and checked the time. Nobody ever showed up unannounced. When I opened the door I froze. Mom and Dad were standing there. They looked exhausted. Mom's eyes were swollen from crying and Dad seemed like he hadn't slept at all. For a second I thought they had come to talk. Maybe even apologize for everything that had happened between us. Instead they started talking before I could say a word. "The doctors think you're probably the best match," Dad said. "They need to test you immediately," Mom added. "They want to move quickly. The sooner the better." The words came so fast they were practically speaking over each other. I stood there trying to process everything. Finally I asked what exactly they meant. Mom explained that because Tate's condition was getting worse, doctors were looking for a bone marrow donor. As his sister I had a strong chance of being compatible. Then she casually mentioned that she had already spoken with the transplant coordinator. Apparently she had informed them I would do the donation if I matched. Not that she would ask. Not that she would discuss it with me. She had simply decided. The realization hit me harder than I expected. I looked from one parent to the other. Neither of them asked how I was feeling. Neither mentioned the surgery I had nearly died from just a few months earlier. Neither acknowledged the weeks of silence between us. It was as if none of that had happened. As if I had been sitting quietly on a shelf waiting for the moment they needed something. I loved Tate. That wasn't the problem. The problem was standing right in front of me. For years, my parents had expected things from me without ever stopping to see me. I gripped the edge of the door and took a slow breath. "I need time to think," I said. Dad looked uncomfortable but stayed silent. Mom's expression hardened immediately. "There isn't time to think, Ren." I stared at her. "Tate could die." The words hung in the air between us. For a long moment nobody moved. Then I quietly asked them to leave. And for the first time neither of them seemed certain I would do what they wanted. After my parents left, I locked the door and stood in the silence for a long time. The conversation kept replaying in my head. Not because they wanted me to help Tate but because of how they approached it. There hadn't been a single question about how I felt. No acknowledgement of the months that had passed. Just an assumption that I would do whatever was needed because that was the role I had always been expected to play. Eventually I walked into the bathroom and sat on the floor. It was the same spot where I had spent some of the hardest days after my surgery. The place where I cried when nobody could see me and where I tried to make sense of everything that had happened. Without really thinking about it, I opened the voice recorder app on my phone. All the old recordings were still there. One by one I scrolled through them. Then I found a file I had completely forgotten about. It had been recorded during my hospital stay. Curious, I pressed play. At first there was only background noise. Distant footsteps. Hospital machines. Then I heard voices. My parents. I remembered now. They had stepped outside my room for a private conversation, not realizing my phone was still recording and that the door hadn't fully closed. I listened carefully. Dad sounded worried. Mom didn't. I wouldn't worry about Ren, she said. She's always been the tough one. Not like Tate. The words hit differently this time. Growing up, I had always heard that phrase as praise. Proof that I was strong. Reliable. But sitting there on the bathroom floor, I finally heard what it really meant. They expected me to survive without support because they had already decided Tate needed theirs more. It wasn't one bad decision. It wasn't the surgery. It wasn't my graduation. It was years of the same pattern. Later that afternoon, Piper came over. For the first time, I played the recordings for someone else. She listened without interrupting. When they ended, she sat quietly for a moment before asking a single question. Do you want to help Tate or do you want to help them? I stared at her. The question changed everything. Because the answer came immediately. I wanted to help Tate. My issue had never been with him. After Piper left, I picked up my phone and called the hospital myself. I agreed to the testing process. But this time it would happen on my terms, not theirs. The testing process moved quickly. Over the next few days, doctors ran what felt like an endless number of blood tests and evaluations. I answered questions, signed paperwork, and waited for results. Eventually, the transplant coordinator called. I was a strong match. The news wasn't surprising, but hearing it confirmed made everything feel more real. A decision was approaching, and before I made it, there was one thing I needed first. I requested a family meeting at the hospital. Everyone would be there, including Tate. By then he was stable enough to sit up and hold conversations. He still looked exhausted when I walked into the room, but seeing him awake brought an unexpected sense of relief. Mom and Dad arrived a few minutes later. From the expressions on their faces, they seemed convinced the meeting was simply a final step before I signed whatever papers were necessary. Mom even looked relieved, as if the difficult part was already over. Once everyone sat down, I placed my phone on the table. I need you to hear something first, I said. Neither of my parents understood what I meant until I pressed play. The recording filled the room. My mother's voice echoed through the speakers. I wouldn't worry about Ren. She's always been the tough one. Not like Tate. Nobody spoke. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything I could have said myself. Mom's face immediately lost color. Dad stared at the floor. Across the room, Tate looked completely shocked. He listened without interrupting as the conversation continued. For the first time, he was hearing what I had lived with for years. Not because he had ignored it. Because he had never been forced to see it. When the recording ended, Mom was the first to speak. That was taken out of context. The response didn't surprise me. I looked at her calmly. What context makes that okay? She opened her mouth but couldn't answer. For the first time, I didn't argue or raise my voice. I simply explained what I had needed months earlier when I woke up alone after surgery. An apology. Acknowledgement. A sign that my pain mattered too. Instead, I got a photo of a trophy. The room stayed quiet. Dad still couldn't look at me. Mom had nothing left to say. Then I felt movement beside me. Tate slowly reached across the table and took my hand. His eyes were filled with regret. Not for something he had done. For something he had finally understood. And in that small moment, for the first time in our lives, it felt like we were standing on the same side. The meeting didn't end immediately after the recording. Everyone remained seated as if nobody knew what to say next. I took a slow breath and looked at Tate. More than anything, I needed him to understand one thing. I'm going through with the donation, I said. His eyes immediately filled with relief. But not because I'm trying to earn anyone's approval. The room became quiet again. I had spent years trying to be understanding. Years telling myself that if I worked harder, achieved more, or stayed patient long enough, things would eventually change. They never did. I'm helping because you're my brother, I continued. I love you. None of this is your fault. Tate lowered his head for a moment. You never treated me like I mattered less. Mom and Dad did. For the first time, I turned directly toward my parents without softening my words. I'm not donating marrow so we can all pretend everything is fine afterward. I'm not doing this so everyone can go back to acting like my accomplishments don't count. Dad looked defeated. Mom sat silently with her arms crossed. I need honesty from both of you, I said. And I need this family to stop pretending that what happened never happened. A long silence followed. Then Tate spoke. She's right. Neither parent responded. Tate looked directly at them. No excuses. She's right. His voice was stronger than I had heard since the accident. I spent my whole life benefiting from it without realizing how bad it was. And I'm ashamed it took almost losing my life for anyone to finally say it out loud. Dad's shoulders slumped. For once he didn't try to defend himself. I failed you, Ren. The words came slowly. I kept telling myself there would be time later. Time to show up. Time to make things right. I was wrong. It wasn't a perfect apology. It didn't erase anything. But it was the first honest one I had ever received from him. Mom remained mostly quiet. She listened, but it was obvious she was still struggling to accept everything that had been said. A few days later, the transplant took place. The doctors were pleased with the outcome and there were no complications. When I woke up afterward, the room felt strangely familiar. The same hospital smell. The same machines. For one brief moment, I expected to see empty chairs again. Instead, Tate was sitting beside my bed. Not scrolling through his phone. Not getting ready to leave. Just sitting there. When our eyes met, he smiled. Hours passed and he never moved from that chair. For the first time, someone stayed. Several months passed after the transplant. Life didn't magically become perfect, but it became something I never thought it could be. Honest. Tate recovered steadily, and as his strength returned, so did something neither of us realized we had been missing for years. Without our parents constantly comparing us or building their lives around his achievements, we finally had the chance to know each other as adults. We started talking more often. Not because of emergencies or family obligations. Because we genuinely wanted to. Sometimes we grabbed lunch together. Other times we simply talked on the phone for an hour about nothing important. The relationship felt easy in a way it never had before. For the first time, Tate wasn't my parents' favorite child. He was just my brother. Things with Mom and Dad were different too. Not fixed. Different. I didn't cut them out of my life completely, but I stopped pretending everything was fine when it wasn't. The relationship became smaller and more realistic. It was built on effort instead of expectations. Mom still slipped into old habits sometimes. She would start talking about one of Tate's accomplishments and forget that other people in the room existed. The difference now was that I didn't stay quiet. When it happened, I calmly pointed it out. Sometimes she got defensive. Sometimes she caught herself and apologized. Either way, I no longer carried the responsibility of protecting everyone's feelings at the expense of my own. Dad surprised me the most. He started showing up. Not for major events. For small ones. A work presentation. A community fundraiser. A weekend art show. The kind of moments he would have ignored in the past. I think he finally understood that relationships aren't repaired through grand speeches. They're repaired through consistency. One choice at a time. Looking back now, I don't regret saving those recordings. I didn't keep them because I wanted revenge. I kept them because for a long time I felt like I needed proof. Proof that the hurt was real. Proof that I wasn't imagining the pattern everyone else seemed determined to ignore. For years I waited for someone to validate what I felt. Now I don't need that anymore. The recordings served their purpose. What protects me today isn't evidence. It's boundaries. I know what I will accept and what I won't. And that's made all the difference. For most of my life I kept waiting in empty rooms hoping someone would eventually choose me. But these days I don't wait anymore. People want to be part of my life, they have to show up. And for the first time, whether they do or not, I'll be okay. If this story touched you, share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to subscribe for more powerful stories like this, and I'll see you in the next one. Take care.